Part 1. The Bloom of Temptation. Valentine's Day was always the busiest time of the year at Petal and Bloom, the quaint little flower shop nestled in the heart of town. Madison had worked there for nearly 6 years, arranging delicate bouquets, tying ribbons around boxes of chocolates, and listening to frantic last-minute customers plead for the perfect gift to win over their significant others. It was exhausting, but she loved the work, loved the scent of fresh roses, the delicate touch of baby's breath, the way flowers could speak when words failed. Today, however, was particularly chaotic. The shop had been bustling since morning, and by the time the sun began to set, Madison's feet ached, and her hands were sore from thorn pricks. Her coworker, Ethan, had been by her side the entire day, helping keep the madness at bay. They had been working together for years, always polite, always professional. Ethan was a steady presence, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the frantic customers that filled the shop. As the last customer left, Madison leaned against the counter, sighing with exhaustion. "I swear, if I see one more desperate boyfriend looking for roses, I might scream." Ethan chuckled, wiping his hands on his apron. "Well, Valentine's Day is all about grand gestures, isn't it?" Madison rolled her eyes. "I suppose. Not that I've had one in a long time." At that, Ethan hesitated. Then, reaching into his apron, he pulled out a small red envelope and a single deep red rose. "Then maybe it's time someone did something about that." Madison blinked in surprise. "What is this?" Ethan exhaled slowly, a flicker of uncertainty in his gaze. "Just something I've wanted to give you for a long time." Her fingers trembled as she took the envelope, sliding out the card inside. The handwriting was neat, deliberate. "You deserve to be cherished, Madison, to be seen, to be adored. Happy Valentine's Day." The words sent a jolt through her. She looked up, heart pounding. "Ethan, He smiled, but there was something guarded in his expression. "I know you're married. I'm not trying to complicate things, but I needed you to know." Madison swallowed hard. Ethan had always been there, reliable, kind, always respectful. And yet, this small, unexpected gesture stirred something deep inside her, something she hadn't felt in a long time. Because her husband, James, had forgotten. Again. They had been married for 8 years, together for 10. Once upon a time, he had been the kind of man who surprised her with candlelit dinners, who left little notes in her purse. But over the years, the romance had faded, buried beneath long work hours and routine. And tonight, as she wiped sweat from her brow, she knew the text would come soon. Her phone buzzed. "James, hey, working late. Don't wait up." Madison stared at the message, feeling the familiar weight of disappointment settle over her. No flowers, no dinner plans, no acknowledgement of the day, just another excuse. She exhaled sharply, lifting her gaze to Ethan. He was watching her, waiting, his expression unreadable. A warmth crept up her neck. "Thank you," she whispered, holding the rose close. Ethan hesitated. Then, in a voice barely above a murmur, he said, "You shouldn't have to feel forgotten." She didn't know what to say to that. Instead, she busied herself with cleaning up, trying to ignore the way her heart pounded in her chest. As the evening stretched on, the shop grew quiet. The flickering overhead lights cast soft shadows against the walls, and the scent of fresh blooms filled the air. Ethan stayed behind to help close up. Madison turned to him just as he opened a bottle of wine from the small break room fridge. "One glass won't hurt," he said with a smirk. "We survived Valentine's Day, after all." She hesitated. The store was empty. The lights were dim. The air was thick with something unspoken, and James wasn't coming home. As Ethan poured the wine, Madison wondered if, just for tonight, she could let herself forget, too. Part 2. The Scent of Betrayal. The first sip of wine felt like warmth spreading through her chest, unwinding the tension coiled deep in her muscles. Madison sat on the counter, her legs swinging lightly, while Ethan leaned against the display case, watching her with a knowing expression. "It's funny," she mused, staring into her glass. "I used to dream about nights like this when I was younger. Something out of a movie. Staying late in a flower shop, drinking wine with someone who actually pays attention to me." Ethan tilted his head. And now that you're living it? She let out a dry laugh. It feels dangerous. He took a slow sip, considering her words. Dangerous isn't always a bad thing. Madison set her glass down, suddenly hyper-aware of how close he was standing. The scent of roses, wine, and something distinctly him filled the air. She could hear her heartbeat in her ears, could feel the unspoken tension pulling them closer. I should go, she whispered, but her body remained rooted in place. Ethan reached out, brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. You could, he murmured, his fingers lingering against her cheek. Or you could let yourself have something that's been missing for a long time. A shiver ran through her. The weight of the moment pressed against her, demanding a choice. Somewhere in the distance, her phone buzzed again. She ignored it. Then, without thinking, she closed the gap between them. The kiss was tentative at first, hesitant, testing. But the moment Ethan's hands slid around her waist, pulling her against him, something inside her snapped. A flood of longing crashed over her, years of neglect and loneliness igniting into something raw, something urgent. Her fingers tangled in his hair as he deepened the kiss, his warmth seeping into her like a drug she hadn't realized she craved. Every touch, every brush of his lips, sent sparks skittering down her spine. The logical part of her brain screamed at her to stop. This was wrong. This was betrayal. But the part of her that had spent years aching for affection, for attention, for this, drowned out the guilt. Ethan's hands traveled down her back, settling on her hips as he lifted her off the counter. She gasped against his lips as he carried her to the small lounge area in the back of the shop, their bodies pressed together as if they had been waiting for this moment forever. They fell onto the worn-out couch, breathless and wanting. His hands roamed her body, setting her skin on fire. Every touch, every whispered word against her skin, chipped away at the walls she had built around herself. She wasn't Madison, the neglected wife. She wasn't the woman waiting for a husband who had long stopped noticing her. For tonight, she was just a woman being seen. The hours blurred together. Soft laughter, hushed whispers, stolen touches beneath dim lights. Madison traced the curve of Ethan's jaw, memorizing the way he looked at her, as if she was the only thing that mattered. But reality had a cruel way of creeping in. The sound of her phone vibrating against the table broke the spell. She glanced at the screen, her heart clenching at the name flashing across it. James. Her stomach twisted. Guilt flooded her chest, dousing the warmth Ethan had wrapped her in. Ethan, sensing the shift, gently cupped her face. You okay? She forced a smile, but it felt brittle. Yeah, I should go. His expression darkened for a split second, so quick she almost missed it. Then he nodded, running a hand through his tousled hair. I understand. But something in his eyes told her that he didn't. She gathered her things, fixing her hair in the reflection of the shop's glass door. Ethan leaned against the counter, watching her with an intensity that sent another shiver down her spine. As she reached for the door, his voice stopped her. This doesn't have to be the last time. Her fingers tightened around the handle. She wanted to say no, to end this before it spiraled further. But when she turned back to him, she hesitated. Ethan smirked, as if he already knew the answer. Madison swallowed hard and stepped out into the night, the cold air biting at her flushed skin. She didn't see the way Ethan's smirk faded the moment the door closed behind her. The next morning, Madison went through the motions. Made breakfast, answered emails, tried to pretend that nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Ethan. Felt his hands, his lips, the way he had made her feel alive. James barely looked at her as he rushed out the door. I'll make it up to you, okay? He said in passing, dropping a hurried kiss on her cheek. She nodded numbly. The weight of last night sat heavy on her chest. She had crossed a line she couldn't uncross, and Ethan wasn't going to let her forget it. Later that day, the bell above Petal and Bloom's door chimed, and her heart lurched in her chest. James stood in the doorway, holding a bouquet of flowers. Surprise, he said, offering a sheepish smile. I know I screwed up yesterday. I wanted to make it up to you. Her breath caught. Guilt clawed at her throat. Before she could respond, Movement behind the counter caught her attention. Ethan stood there, arranging a fresh bouquet, his expression calm. But when their eyes met, something cold lurked behind his gaze. He nodded at her as if nothing had happened, but there was a knowing gleam in his eyes. A silent promise. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Part 3. A Thorn Among Roses. Madison hadn't been able to shake the weight pressing against her chest since the moment James walked into the shop with that bouquet. The colors had been beautiful. Roses, tulips, even baby's breath tucked in between. But they meant nothing to her. Not anymore. Not after last night. The worst part wasn't the guilt. It wasn't even the fear that James would somehow find out. It was the way Ethan had looked at her. The way his gaze lingered, a silent reminder of everything they had done. The way he smirked like he knew she wouldn't be able to stay away. Madison spent the rest of the day in a fog. Customers came and went, their laughter and excitement buzzing through the air like an electric current she no longer felt. She tried to focus on the arrangements, on the business, but she could feel Ethan watching her. His presence had become suffocating, a constant reminder that she had crossed a line she could never uncross. And yet, she didn't leave. When the last customer left and the shop doors were locked, Madison found herself lingering behind as Ethan wiped down the counters. She told herself it was to finish the inventory, to make sure everything was prepped for tomorrow's orders. But deep down, she knew better. Long day, Ethan murmured from behind her. She nodded, refusing to look up from the clipboard in her hands. Yeah. A moment of silence stretched between them before he took a step closer. She felt it before she saw it, the warmth of his body mere inches from hers. "You've been avoiding me," he said softly. Madison swallowed, gripping the clipboard tighter. "I don't know what you're talking about." Ethan chuckled, a deep, knowing sound that sent a shiver down her spine. "You don't have to lie, Maddie. Not to me." His fingers brushed against her arm, light and teasing, and for a split second, she let herself lean into it. Let herself feel the thrill of something forbidden. Then she pulled away. "This was a mistake," she whispered. Ethan's expression darkened, the playful glint in his eyes hardening into something more dangerous. "Was it?" Madison forced herself to meet his gaze. "Yes." A beat passed, then another. Ethan exhaled sharply, shaking his head with a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes. "If that's what you want to tell yourself." Madison turned on her heel and grabbed her coat, heart pounding. She needed to leave, needed to put space between them before she did something reckless again. But just as she reached the door, Ethan's voice stopped her cold. "I wonder what James would think if he knew his wife had been in my arms last night." Her breath hitched. Slowly, she turned back around, stomach twisting into knots. "You wouldn't." Ethan leaned against the counter, arms crossed over his chest, amusement flickering in his gaze. "Wouldn't I?" Her pulse thundered in her ears. "What do you want?" His smirk widened. "That depends. How badly do you want to keep your little secret?" That night, Madison lay in bed beside James, staring up at the ceiling. He had fallen asleep quickly, his breathing even, his arm draped over her waist as if nothing had changed, as if she weren't drowning in a sea of her own making. Ethan's words haunted her. "How badly do you want to keep your little secret?" She squeezed her eyes shut, willing herself to block it all out. The guilt, the shame, the lingering ache of Ethan's touch. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't ignore the cold, hard truth. This wasn't over. And Ethan wasn't going to let her walk away so easily. The next morning, Madison went about her routine like nothing had happened. She made breakfast, showered, even kissed James on the cheek as he left for work. But the weight in her chest remained. Her phone vibrated on the kitchen counter. She hesitated before picking it up. "Ethan, we need to talk. Don't ignore me." She exhaled sharply. Ignoring him wasn't an option anymore. By lunchtime, she was back at the flower shop. Ethan was waiting for her, leaning against the counter, that same knowing smirk playing on his lips. "I knew you'd come," he said smoothly. Madison crossed her arms, steeling herself. "What do you want, Ethan?" He stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating off him. "I think you already know." Her heart pounded. "This has to stop." Ethan tilted his head, amusement dancing in his gaze. Stop? Maddie, we haven't even begun. She swallowed hard, her resolve wavering. I love my husband. Ethan traced a finger along the edge of the counter, watching her. Funny, you didn't seem to remember that last night. Heat flushed her cheeks. I made a mistake. His smirk faded slightly, replaced by something sharper. Did you? Madison's breath caught as Ethan reached for her hand, his fingers grazing hers. A familiar electricity sparked between them, making it harder to pull away. She knew she should. She knew she had to. But as Ethan's grip tightened, she realized that walking away wouldn't be as easy as she had thought. Part 4. The Price of Desire. Madison had thought she could control this. She had convinced herself that she could walk away, that Ethan was nothing more than a lapse in judgment, a moment of weakness that she would bury and forget. But Ethan wasn't letting go. The messages came throughout the day, subtle at first, a simple, thinking of you, then more insistent. You can't ignore me forever. By the time the sun had set and she was alone in the flower shop, she was already caught in his web. The sound of the door clicking shut made her turn, and there he was, standing in the dim light, a knowing smirk on his lips. I told you we weren't finished, Ethan said, his voice low and smooth. Madison's breath caught in her throat. You shouldn't be here. He took a slow step forward. You don't want me to leave. Her fingers clenched around the edge of the counter, the weight of her guilt pressing heavy on her chest. Ethan, this has to stop. But even as she said it, she knew it was a lie. The tension between them was electric, pulling them together like gravity. Ethan reached out, his fingers tracing a delicate line down her arm, sending shivers through her. Tell me you don't want this, he murmured. She should. She needed to. But instead of stepping away, her body betrayed her, leaning into his touch. The line had been crossed long ago, but tonight, it shattered completely. Their lips met with urgency, her hands tangled in his hair as he pressed her against the counter. The scent of roses filled the air, mixing with the heat between them. This was madness, reckless, but it was also intoxicating. Ethan lifted her onto the counter, his hands firm on her waist as he deepened the kiss. Every rational thought dissolved, replaced by the raw need coursing through her veins. She had never felt this alive. But as quickly as the moment overtook her, reality came crashing back down. Her phone buzzed violently against the wooden surface of the counter. The name on the screen sent ice through her veins. James. Panic surged through her. She pushed Ethan away, her breath coming in sharp gasps. I have to go. Ethan's jaw clenched, his frustration evident, but he stepped back, watching as she grabbed her things with shaking hands. This isn't over, he said, his voice carrying a dark promise. She didn't look back as she rushed out of the shop, the cold night air biting at her skin. She needed to get home. She needed to remind herself of who she was supposed to be. James was waiting when she arrived, sitting on the couch with a weary expression. He looked up, relief flickering in his eyes. You're late. Madison forced a smile, dropping her bag by the door. Busy day. He stood, crossing the room to wrap his arms around her. She stiffened slightly before forcing herself to relax into his embrace. I missed you, he murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. Her stomach twisted. I missed you too. The words tasted like ash. The next morning, Madison woke to find a note on the kitchen counter. James had left early for work, but his message was simple, sweet. A reminder of the man she had once adored. Dinner tonight? Just us. I love you. She stared at the note, her chest tightening. This was what she had wanted. This was the life she had built, the stability, the love. So why did her fingers itch to pick up her phone and text Ethan? Her hands trembled as she reached for her coffee, trying to push away the thoughts clawing at her mind. But deep down, she knew the truth. She had made her choice. And now, she had to live with it. The day dragged on, an agonizing blend of self-recrimination and temptation. She went through the motions at the shop, her fingers arranging flowers automatically while her mind spiraled. She nearly dropped a vase when the doorbell chimed in the late afternoon. Ethan stood there, casually leaning against the doorframe, a smirk tugging at his lips. "Miss me?" Madison's pulse quickened. "You need to leave." He stepped inside, shutting the door behind him. "You don't really want that." Her hands clenched into fists. "I have plans with my husband tonight. This ends here." Ethan's expression darkened. "You can lie to yourself all you want, but you can't lie to me. You think one dinner with James is going to erase last night?" His voice was laced with quiet amusement, but there was something else beneath it, something possessive. Madison swallowed hard. "It has to." Ethan took another step closer. "I'm not going anywhere, Maddie. And deep down, you don't want me to." Her phone buzzed in her pocket. "James." Her hands trembled as she answered. "Hey, I can't wait for tonight," James said warmly. "I'll make your favorite." Madison's throat tightened. "I can't wait either." Ethan's smirk widened as she ended the call, his gaze never leaving hers. "See you soon, beautiful." As he walked out, Madison realized with chilling certainty that she was no longer in control, and she wasn't sure she wanted to be. Part 5. A Bloom of Consequences. Madison had spent the day walking on the edge of a knife, the weight of her choices pressing into her with every step she took. The past few weeks had felt like a dream, a fevered, dangerous, exhilarating dream. But as she sat at dinner with James, she realized that dreams always ended. And this one was unraveling fast. James had gone out of his way to make the evening special. A candlelit table, her favorite wine, the scent of freshly baked bread filling the air. His blue eyes, once so easy to read, now carried a softness that made her insides twist with guilt. He had no idea, no clue that the woman sitting across from him had betrayed everything they had built together. He reached across the table, his fingers brushing over hers. "You've seemed distant lately," he said softly. "Is everything okay?" Madison forced a smile. "Just work stress. You know how Valentine's rush is." Her voice sounded steady, but inside, she was crumbling. James squeezed her hand. "I know I've been busy too. Maybe after this season, we can take a trip together. Just us." Her heart ached at the sincerity in his voice. She should have said yes. She should have taken the lifeline he was offering. But before she could respond, her phone buzzed in her lap. She didn't have to look to know who it was. "Ethan." Her breath hitched, and James noticed. "Who is it?" Madison hesitated for half a second too long. "Just one of the suppliers. I'll check later." James studied her, his expression unreadable. "All right," he said, but there was a hint of something, doubt, suspicion, in his tone. After dinner, Madison found herself pacing the living room, phone in hand. She should delete the messages. She should block his number. Instead, she opened them. "Ethan, you're with him, aren't you? Ethan, did he tell you he loves you? Ethan, does he make you feel the way I do?" Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, but before she could type a response, another message came through. "Ethan, meet me. Now." Her pulse pounded. This was dangerous. She knew it, but she also knew she couldn't ignore him. The air was crisp when she arrived at the shop. Ethan was already inside, leaning against the counter with that knowing smirk. "I knew you'd come," he murmured. Madison crossed her arms. "This has to stop." He tilted his head. "Is that really what you want?" She opened her mouth to say yes, but the words didn't come. Because in that moment, looking at him, she wasn't sure. Ethan stepped closer. "You can lie to yourself, Maddie, but you can't lie to me." Her breath caught as he reached for her, his fingers trailing along her jawline. "James is a good man," she whispered, but the words lacked conviction. Ethan's lips curved into a smirk. "And yet, you're here." Madison closed her eyes, torn between the life she had and the fire that Ethan had ignited inside her. She had never felt more alive than when she was with him, but that same passion was threatening to consume everything she held dear. A noise from outside made them both freeze. Madison turned, her heart slamming against her ribs. "James." He stood just beyond the glass door, his expression a mix of confusion and something far worse, realization. Madison's stomach dropped. Ethan stepped back, slipping his hands into his pockets as if nothing had happened. James pushed the door open, his eyes never leaving hers. What's going on? Madison opened her mouth, but no words came out. There was nothing she could say that would make this right. James exhaled sharply, his hands balling into fists. How long? Tears burned at the back of her eyes. James, He held up a hand, shaking his head. I don't want excuses, Madison. I want the truth. The weight of her choices pressed down on her, suffocating her. She could feel Ethan's gaze on her, calm and composed, as if he had been expecting this. Maybe he had. James's voice was quieter when he spoke again. Did you ever love me? Madison's chest ached. I do love you. His laugh was hollow. Not enough. Silence stretched between them. Finally, James let out a long breath and turned toward the door. I'll send someone to get my things. Madison's throat tightened. James, please. But he was already gone. Ethan let out a low whistle. Well, that was intense. Madison turned on him, anger flaring in her chest. You planned this, didn't you? You wanted him to find out. Ethan's smirk didn't waver. You always belonged to me, Maddie. He was just in the way. Her blood ran cold. She had made a terrible mistake, and now there was no way out.